The cold tile pressed against my cheek as I lay on the floor of my own design studio, vertigo having swept my feet from under me without warning. Through the doorway, I could hear my son James laughing with potential clients in the main office of Reynolds Architecture, the firm I had co-founded 37 years ago. Their voices carried clearly through the ventilation system I had engineered, my innovative design now allowing me to hear them, discussing Richard Reynolds' groundbreaking approach to sustainable architecture, as if I had never existed. No one came to check on me for nearly an hour, though 3 people walked past the partially open door. After designing 14 landmark buildings, revolutionizing sustainable urban systems that generated millions in licensing revenue, and creating the very walls around them, I had become invisible furniture rather than founding partner. My name is Barbara Reynolds. I'm 64 years old, and this is the story of how my son erased my architectural career from history, and how the documentation habits he once mocked ultimately exposed the truth about my life's work. Before I was Richard's widow or James's mother, I designed sustainable buildings that transformed skylines and saved millions in energy costs. What my family forgot. Architects document everything. If this situation resonates with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. I managed to pull myself up using the drafting table, the same one where I designed the revolutionary rainfall collection system now featured on the cover of Architectural Innovations Monthly. Under the headline, Richard Reynolds Pioneering Sustainable Designs. My late husband had been in Singapore when I developed that system. He'd never claimed credit for it while alive, but now, 14 months after his death, my son had constructed an elaborate narrative positioning himself as the inheritor of his father's visionary approach, an approach that had flowed from my pencil, not Richard's. My hands trembled slightly as I steadied myself against the desk. The vertigo wasn't entirely unexpected. Stress and exhaustion had been building since I'd moved to the guest house on our property 3 months earlier, allowing James and his wife Melissa to occupy the main home I had designed. What was unexpected was how quickly this single episode would become evidence of my supposed cognitive decline. Mom's been having some confusion lately, I overheard James telling Dr. Whitman on the phone later that evening. First the memory issues with the Westridge project, and now this episode. Yes, I've been considering having her evaluated. Memory issues. The phrase lodged in my throat like a shard of glass. What James called confusion was my accurate recollection that I, not Richard, had designed the Westridge building's sustainability systems. Systems now being submitted to the Architectural Heritage Committee for landmark designation under Richard's name, exclusively. I moved carefully to the window, watching darkness settle over the garden I'd landscaped decades earlier. In the main house, lights glowed warmly. Through one window, I could see James at Richard's old desk, reviewing documents that detailed my professional life's work. On the wall behind him hung only Richard's awards. My own credentials and recognition remained boxed in storage, deemed unnecessary clutter during the move. A text message illuminated my phone. Meeting with the Architectural Heritage Committee tomorrow at 10. Dad's buildings are being considered for landmark designation. No need for you to attend. I've got it covered. Dad's buildings. Not our firm's buildings. Not the Reynolds & Reynolds portfolio. Not the structures I had designed. Dad's buildings. Something shifted inside me, a structural realization as clear as when I'd solved the cantilever problem for the Westridge building. This wasn't casual oversight or convenience, it was systematic erasure of my professional fatigue. The vertigo had passed, but a new sensation took its place, the clarifying anger of an architect who suddenly sees the true structure beneath a deceptive facade. I moved to my closet and reached behind my winter clothes, extracting a small key hidden in an architectural model I'd built during graduate school. I hadn't entered the archive room since Richard's death, but now, a powerful certainty guided my movements. Time to rebuild from the foundation, I whispered to myself, architectural terminology fitting this moment of personal reconstruction, with evidence no one can dismiss. The archive room key turned stiffly in the lock. I hadn't entered this space since Richard's death, 14 months ago. A thin layer of dust confirmed my son's lack of interest in the room's contents. Ironic, considering this climate-controlled vault contained the true architectural history he was now rewriting. I flipped a light switch. Floor-to-ceiling shelving lined 3 walls, filled with labeled boxes containing complete documentation for every project spanning 37 years. The 4th wall held flat files of originals, each drawer precisely marked with project names and dates. "Let's see what fabrications you've been sharing about the Westridge building," I murmured, moving to the appropriate section and pulling the relevant box. Inside, in my precise handwriting, complete documentation of the rainfall system's development, conceptual sketches, mathematical calculations, testing results, material specifications, every element bearing my professional stamp and signature. My fingers trembled slightly as I found what I was looking for. Richard's initialed approval of my design, with his handwritten note, "B's innovation again saves both budget and environmental impact. Brilliant solution." The paper crinkled gently as I held it to the light. Richard had known exactly whose work it was, even as he became the public face of our partnership. The sound of car tires on gravel cut through my thoughts. Through the narrow window, I watched James's BMW pull into the driveway. He emerged carrying a stack of presentation boards. Materials for tomorrow's Heritage Committee meeting. Materials that would present Richard Reynolds as the sole creative force behind buildings I had designed. I returned the documentation to its box and selected several others, one for each building under consideration for landmark designation. For the next hour, I methodically compiled evidence of my authorship, original sketches, development notes, client communications, and Richard's explicit acknowledgments of my designs. The pattern became increasingly clear. While Richard had never claimed credit for my work during his lifetime, James was now systematically erasing my contributions from architectural history. I was sliding the final file back into place when my phone vibrated with a text message from my daughter-in-law. "Barbara, we need your signature on some paperwork for the Heritage Committee. Nothing urgent, just some standard forms. I'll bring them to the guest house after dinner." Standard forms. My architectural training had taught me to read the fine print, especially when presented as standard. I hadn't seen any documentation related to the landmark applications, despite my name being on the original architectural stamps. Closing the archive room, I returned to the guest house, documentation securely stored in my portfolio. I had just settled at my small desk when a sharp knock announced Melissa's arrival. "Barbara, hope you're feeling better," she said, her practiced concern not quite reaching her eyes. "James mentioned your dizzy spell. Have you called Dr. Whitman yet?" "I'm fine, thank you," I replied, maintaining a neutral tone. "Just a bit of vertigo from overwork." "What are these forms you mentioned?" Melissa placed a folder on my desk, open to a signature page. "Just authorization for the Heritage Committee submission. Nothing complex. We've prepared all the materials. James has been working night and day on the presentation." I noted how the folder was positioned to show only the signature page, not the preceding documents. An old negotiation tactic. Richard and I had encountered countless times with contractors trying to slip in additional terms. "I'd like to review the full application before signing," I said, pulling the folder toward me and turning to the first page. A flash of annoyance crossed Melissa's face before her smile reasserted itself. "Of course, though it's all fairly technical. James has streamlined the attribution to make it clearer for the committee. He's positioning the sustainable elements as the Reynolds legacy, much more marketable than trying to parse individual contributions." I flipped through the application, my architect's eye quickly identifying the systematic pattern. Every innovation I had designed was attributed to Richard Reynolds, founder of Reynolds Architecture. My name appeared only once, in a footnote listing additional firm members. "This isn't accurate," I said quietly, placing the folder back on the desk without signing. "These systems were my designs, not Richard's." The documentation clearly shows that. Melissa's smile tightened. "Barbara, these applications need to tell a cohesive story. The committee responds, better to a clear narrative about design vision. Frankly, having too many names confuses the historical. Does accuracy confuse historical significance? I asked, keeping my voice measured, despite the heat rising in my chest. James feels strongly that positioning his father's legacy properly is important for the firm's future, Melissa replied, her marketing background evident in the careful phrasing. Clients respond to the narrative of architectural vision, passed from father to son. It's not personal, it's business positioning. Architecture is both personal and precise, I said. These submissions should reflect actual authorship. I'd be happy to provide the original documentation for each system under consideration. Melissa's expression shifted to the practiced patience one might show a difficult child. Barbara, James mentioned you've been confused about some of the project details lately. It's perfectly understandable. You and Richard collaborated for decades, and memory can blur who did what, especially after a loss. The condescension landed like a physical blow. This wasn't casual oversight. It was deliberate gaslighting, using my recent Vertigo incident to question my professional memory. I'm not confused about who designed the rainfall collection system for the Westridge building, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Or the ventilation system for Riverside Cultural Center. Or any of the other innovations being presented as Richard's work. The documentation is quite clear. Documentation? Melissa's eyebrow raised slightly. James mentioned you kept extensive files, but honestly, those old papers may not reflect the final development process. Richard often refined concepts after initial documentation. Did James tell you that? Or did Richard? I asked directly. Melissa gathered the unsigned forms, her movements precise and controlled. I think you're tired. We can discuss this tomorrow after the committee meeting. I'd like to attend the meeting, I said, rising from my chair. Since my designs are being presented, that's not necessary, Melissa replied quickly. James has everything prepared, and after your episode yesterday, we wouldn't want to strain you unnecessarily. After she left, I stood by the window watching her cross the garden to the main house. My house, the one I had designed with south-facing windows to capture maximum natural light. Through those windows I could see James at Richard's desk. Melissa joined him, gesturing with the folder. James looked up toward the guest house, his expression unreadable at this distance. I turned away, moving to my small desk where my laptop glowed with an email notification. Dr. Amara Chen, an architectural historian I'd never met, was requesting an interview about women in sustainable architecture for her research on uncredited contributions to the field. I've been studying the innovative systems in several Reynolds and Reynolds buildings, she wrote. While attribution lists only Richard Reynolds, analysis suggests a different hand in the sustainable elements. I'd be grateful for your insights into these designs. For the first time in months, I felt something beyond grief and confusion, the clarifying anger of someone seeing systematic injustice with sudden precision. This wasn't casual oversight or convenient simplification. This was deliberate erasure of my professional existence, using my recent health incident to question my memory and competence. My son had learned architecture at my drafting table. I had taught him to draw before he could write. Now he was using that knowledge to rewrite history, positioning himself as the inheritor of an architectural legacy that erased my contributions entirely. The Riverside Cultural Center soared above us, its curved facade catching the morning light exactly as I had designed it to do. Dr. Amara Chen walked beside me, her recorder capturing our conversation as we approached the building. At 42, she carried herself with the confident intensity I recognized from my early career. A woman determined to be taken seriously in a field still dominated by men. The conventional narrative credits Richard Reynolds with revolutionizing sustainable urban design, she said, checking her notes. Yet my analysis suggests two distinct design approaches within the same firm. The structural elements follow one pattern, while the environmental systems show markedly different thinking. I smiled faintly. What specific differences did you notice? The sustainable systems show a mathematical precision that's distinctive, she replied. They're elegant in ways that prioritize efficiency over visual impact. They're meant to be felt rather than seen. We paused at the entrance, where a bronze plaque commemorated the building's opening 15 years earlier. Designed by Richard Reynolds, it proclaimed, Reynolds and Reynolds Architecture. My name was absent, despite my spending 3 years developing the ventilation system that made the building's open concept possible without excessive energy consumption. Whose name appears on the architectural stamps for the original plans? I asked, watching her reaction. Dr. Chen met my gaze directly. Yours does, Miss Reynolds. On all the sustainable system designs for this building and 6 others I've researched. Yet the public attribution consistently names only your husband. Something shifted inside me, not the disorienting spin of vertigo, but the clarifying realignment of perspective. Here was external validation of what I had always known. My contributions weren't confused memories, as James and Melissa suggested, but documented facts recognized by objective analysis. Would you like to see how the ventilation system actually works? I asked, removing my access card from my wallet. Despite James's attempts to distance me from firm operations, he hadn't yet deactivated my security credentials. Absolutely, Dr. Chen replied, her eyes brightening with scholarly enthusiasm. I led her through the public areas, pointing out features invisible to casual observers, but fundamental to the building's functionality. Notice how cool air flows through this space without artificial chill or noticeable drafts, I explained as we entered the main hall. The system draws fresh air through filters embedded in those wall panels, thermally conditions it using passive exchange, and circulates it through displacement ventilation. Dr. Chen took notes rapidly. This predates similar systems by nearly a decade. The energy consumption reports show a 34% reduction compared to conventional buildings of that era. We continued to the mechanical room, normally off limits to visitors. I keyed in the access code, my birth date, a detail I had specified during construction and apparently never changed. This is the heart of the system, I said, gesturing to the complex arrangement of ducts and exchange mechanisms. See how the primary distribution manifold integrates with the structural support. That's the innovation that makes the entire system efficient. I designed it after studying termite mounds in Zimbabwe, which maintain constant interior temperatures despite extreme external fluctuations. I ran my hand along one of the ducts, feeling the slight vibration of air flowing through systems I had calculated to the millimeter. I spent 3 years developing this approach, testing 17 different configurations before finalizing this design. And Richard Reynolds' contribution to this system was? Dr. Chen asked, her recorder capturing the ambient hum of efficient machinery. Richard was an exceptional architect with particular genius for spatial relationships and client communication, I said carefully. Our partnership worked because we had complementary strengths. He never claimed to have designed these systems during his lifetime. Yet the historical record increasingly credits him exclusively, she observed, particularly since his death. I nodded, feeling a strange combination of grief and clarity. History is written by those who control the narrative. As we exited the mechanical room, my phone vibrated with a text from James. Heritage Committee approved landmark designation for Riverside and Westridge, celebrating at the office. Media release going out this afternoon. A cold certainty settled in my chest. The Architectural Heritage Committee is announcing landmark designations today, I told Dr. Chen. I believe they've approved this building and the Westridge building based on applications that attribute all the sustainable innovations to Richard Reynolds. That's a significant historical misattribution, Dr. Chen said, frowning. Based on my research and what you've shown me today, your contributions appear fundamental to what makes these buildings historically significant. We emerged from the building into bright sunlight. Across the plaza, a familiar figure strode toward the parking area. James, moving with the confident purpose of someone whose plans were unfolding perfectly. He hadn't seen us yet. Dr. Chen, I said quietly, what exactly is your research focusing on? Uncredited women in architectural innovation, she replied, specifically examining how sustainable design advances have been systematically attributed to men, despite evidence of female authorship. Your work represents perhaps the most significant case study I've documented. I watched my son disappear into the parking garage, carrying presentation materials that erased my professional legacy while building his own. The research I'd found in the archive room last night confirmed what I was now seeing with painful clarity. James wasn't just honoring his father. He was strategically reconstructing our firm's history to position himself as the inheritor of an architectural legacy from which I had been deliberately removed. Would you be interested in viewing my complete documentation archives? I asked Dr. Chen. I have every development stage of these systems, including original sketches, calculations, meeting notes, and Richard's written acknowledgments of my authorship. Her eyes widened. That would be extraordinary. Contemporary architectural archives rarely preserve such comprehensive documentation. I've been called obsessive about documentation throughout my career, I said with a slight smile. It seems that thorough record-keeping may serve purposes beyond architectural history. As we walked toward my car, a news alert appeared on my phone. Reynolds Architecture celebrates historic landmark designations. James Reynolds carries forward father's sustainable legacy. I showed the notification to Dr. Chen. The accompanying photo showed James standing beside enlarged renderings of my environmental systems, positioned before a backdrop that proclaimed the Reynolds legacy, 3 generations of sustainable innovation. The 3 generations apparently included James's teenage son, who had expressed no interest in architecture but served the marketing narrative. 3 generations of Reynolds men, I said quietly. Convenient framing that simply erases me from the equation. The drive back to my property was quiet, my thoughts organizing themselves with the same systematic precision I'd once applied to ventilation calculations. This wasn't casual oversight. It was strategic elimination of my professional identity to serve a compelling narrative, architectural genius passed from father to son, with no inconvenient female contributor complicating the story. As we pulled into the driveway, I could see celebration underway at the main house. Cars filled the circular drive, and caterers moved efficiently between vehicles and the front entrance. The landmark designations were clearly being commemorated with an impromptu industry reception, to which I had not been invited, despite the designated buildings containing my most significant designs. Perhaps we should use the studio entrance, I suggested to Dr. Chen, directing her toward the separate access to my workspace. As we approached, I spotted Melissa leading a photographer around the garden, gesturing toward architectural features I had designed 30 years earlier. Inside my studio, I unlocked the archive room. Dr. Chen's face registered professional awe as she took in the comprehensive documentation system. "This is extraordinary," she said, examining the organization method. "Most architectural records from this era are fragmented at best. You've preserved the complete evolutionary process." "Architecture is cumulative," I replied, pulling boxes labeled with project names now being celebrated without my acknowledgement. "Each decision builds upon previous ones. Without documentation, we lose the logic behind why buildings function as they do." For the next hour, I showed Dr. Chen my original sketches, development notes, and technical specifications for the systems now attributed entirely to Richard and celebrated as James's inheritance. Her recorder captured our conversation as I explained the conceptual evolution of each innovation, pointing out Richard's handwritten acknowledgments on key documents. "This documentation conclusively establishes your authorship," Dr. Chen said finally, her academic precision matching my architectural thoroughness. "It's not ambiguous or subject to interpretation. These systems emerged from your design process, not your husband's." "Yet the historical record now says otherwise," I noted, "and becomes more firmly established with each iteration of the narrative." "History can be corrected with proper evidence," she replied. "My research specifically addresses how architectural contributions by women have been systematically attributed to male colleagues or partners. Your case is particularly significant because the documentation is so comprehensive." Through the window, I could see guests arriving for the celebration. A banner had been hung, celebrating the Reynolds legacy of sustainable innovation. Below it, enlarged photographs showed Richard at various building sites, with James now positioned beside project renderings in identical poses. Visual reinforcement of the father-son legacy narrative. They're rewriting history in real time, I said quietly, using my heart episode to suggest I'm confused about my own work. Your vertigo incident? Dr. Chen asked. After I experienced vertigo in the office last week, James began suggesting I was having memory issues about project authorship, I explained. It's a convenient narrative. Elderly widow confused about her late husband's work, mixing up supportive contributions with actual design authorship. Dr. Chen's expression hardened. That's gaslighting, Miss Reynolds. Using a health incident to question your professional memory despite documented evidence. The term landed with clarifying precision. I had understood the pattern, but hadn't named it. Gaslighting, I repeated, the word fitting perfectly into the architectural structure of understanding I was building, using my vulnerability to reconstruct reality, and leveraging gender and age bias, Dr. Chen added. Society finds it easier to believe an older woman is confused than that she's been systematically erased from her own professional accomplishments. Through the window, I watched James speaking to gathered colleagues, his gestures echoing Richard's characteristic presentation style. The performance was impressively seamless. The devoted son carrying forward his father's vision, with no mention of the woman who had actually designed the systems now being historically designated. What are you going to do? Dr. Chen asked quietly. I turned from the window facing the comprehensive documentation I had meticulously maintained throughout my career. Boxes of evidence that contradicted the narrative being presented not 50 yards away. Architects understand that appearances can be deceiving, I said, my voice steadier than it had been in months. What matters is the structural integrity beneath the facade. The next morning, sunlight streamed through my studio windows as I spread documentation across the conference table. 3 days had passed since the landmark celebration. I had sorted the evidence chronologically, creating a clear architectural narrative of my contributions. The documentation told an unambiguous story, original sketches in my distinctive hand, development notes, documenting each innovation's evolution, technical specifications with my professional stamp, client presentations, showing my role, and Richard's explicit acknowledgments, my authorship throughout our partnership. Most compelling were Richard's handwritten notes on key designs. Barbara's ventilation approach solves the efficiency problem brilliantly. V's rainfall collection system will revolutionize water conservation in urban settings. Only Sattervry could have integrated these systems so seamlessly. His admiration had been genuine and specific. He never claimed my innovations as his own during his lifetime. The doorbell interrupted my thoughts. Caroline Wilson, the architectural intellectual property attorney I'd contacted yesterday, stood on my doorstep. At 66, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had navigated male-dominated professional environments for decades. Thank you for coming, Caroline, I said, leading her to my studio. Your message intrigued me, she replied, setting her briefcase on the table. Architectural attribution disputes are becoming increasingly common, but rarely with such comprehensive documentation. For the next hour, I walked her through the evidence, while explaining the systematic erasure of my contributions since Richard's death. She examined key documents with professional thoroughness, asking precise questions about project development, public attribution, and licensing arrangements. Let me be direct, Barbara, she said finally. The documentation conclusively establishes your authorship of these sustainable systems. The intellectual property rights should reflect that reality, particularly regarding ongoing licensing revenue. The licensing agreements were originally structured under both our names, I explained, but since Richard's death, James has redirected that revenue to accounts I don't control, positioning it as the firm's legacy income rather than compensation for specific innovations. That's potentially actionable, Caroline noted, making rapid notes, especially given the substantial revenue these systems generate, approximately $2.3 million annually. I confirmed. The ventilation system alone is licensed in 17 recent projects across 4 countries. Caroline looked up sharply. And you're not receiving appropriate financial compensation for your intellectual property? I receive what James categorizes as family disbursements, which have progressively decreased over the past year, I replied. When I've questioned this, I'm told I don't need to worry about complex financial matters. That's financial manipulation, she said bluntly. Combined with the documented evidence of your authorship, we have multiple potential claims: intellectual property rights violation, financial misappropriation, and if you choose to pursue it, age and gender discrimination. I considered her assessment carefully. My goal isn't punitive action against my son. It's restoration of accurate attribution and appropriate financial control over my innovations. I want correction, not confrontation. Understood. Caroline nodded, though confrontation may be unavoidable, given the systematic nature of this erasure. The landmark designations create particular urgency, since they permanently embed inaccurate attribution in the historical record. She gestured toward the documentation spread across the table. What you've shown me isn't ambiguous. These innovations emerged from your design process, were executed under your professional stamp, and generated substantial revenue through your analytical property. The recent reframing as Richard's legacy contradicts documented reality and leverages my recent health incident to suggest I'm confused about my own work, I added, which adds a particularly troubling dimension, Caroline agreed. Using a health episode to question professional memory despite documented evidence is inappropriate at best, potentially abusive at worst. The doorbell rang again. Dr. Chen had arrived for our scheduled interview. I introduced her to Caroline, explaining that I had engaged legal counsel to address the attribution issues. This introduces an important dimension to my research, Dr. Chen noted as she set up her recording equipment. I'm documenting historical patterns of women's uncredited architectural contributions, but here we have an active case of attribution being deliberately revised in real time. As we positioned ourselves for the interview, my phone vibrated with an incoming call from James. I let it go to voicemail, focusing instead on Dr. Chen's questions about my architectural approach and the development-specific sustainable systems. For the next 2 hours, I detailed my contributions to each building now designated as architecturally significant, providing specific evidence of my authorship. The process was simultaneously exhausting and exhilarating, like finally presenting a complex design to clients who could truly appreciate its innovation. As Dr. Chen reviewed key documents, Caroline's phone pinged with an email notification. The Architectural Heritage Committee has published the official landmark designations, she said, scanning the message. As expected, the attribution lists only Richard Reynolds for the sustainable innovations. She turned her screen toward us, showing the official documentation now entered into the historical record. The visionary sustainable approaches pioneered by Richard Reynolds represent significant innovations in architectural environmental systems. Not a single mention of your contributions, Dr. Chen noted, her academic precision edged with genuine outrage. Despite your name being on the original architectural stamps and all technical specifications. My voicemail notification appeared. James had left a message. I pressed play, setting the phone to speaker mode. Mom, we need to discuss some restructuring of the firm's financial arrangements. His voice sounded casual but rehearsed. Melissa and I are considering moving your disbursements to quarterly rather than monthly, for better cash flow management. Also, the heritage designation has created some media interest, a profile piece on Dad's sustainable legacy. I'll handle it, so don't worry about preparing any statements. Call me when you can. The systematic nature of the situation clarified further with each development. Financial control being progressively restricted, health concerns used to question professional memory, media narrative being tightly managed, historical record being permanently altered. He's accelerating the process, Caroline observed. The landmark designations have created momentum he's capitalizing on to solidify the revised narrative. and further distance me from my own work. I added, architectural clarity sharpening my perception of the structural pattern. Each step makes any future correction more difficult as the altered attribution becomes more deeply embedded in the historical record. Dr. Chen looked thoughtful. The timing suggests strategic awareness. Your vertigo episode created an opportunity to question your memory, which supports the revised attribution being formalized through the landmark designation, which in turn justifies consolidating financial control over licensing revenue. The question becomes how to respond effectively, Caroline said. We have multiple potential approaches based on the documentation you've provided. She outlined 3 strategic options, each with different impacts and timelines. As she spoke, I found myself applying the same analytical process I'd used when evaluating structural challenges in complex buildings, identifying stress points, load-bearing elements, and potential failure risks. The immediate priority is preserving your financial independence, Caroline emphasized. The intellectual property rights for these systems represent substantial ongoing revenue that should rightfully flow to you as the documented creator, followed by correcting the historical record before the revised attribution becomes further solidified. Dr. Chen added, academic publication can serve as counterbalance to the current narrative, especially with your comprehensive documentation. As they discussed strategy details, I moved to my drafting table, where preliminary designs for the Women in Architecture Foundation headquarters rested. My hands traced the lines I had drawn, the building that would house research on women's uncredited architectural contributions, including my own. A clarity was settling over me with architectural precision. This wasn't just about my personal recognition, it was about structural integrity and how architectural history records contributions, particularly those of women whose innovations have been systematically attributed to male colleagues, partners, or family members. My phone vibrated again. Melissa this time. The text message read, Barbara, are you available to discuss some financial paperwork? James has prepared documents regarding the firm's restructuring that need your signature. Nothing urgent, just standard forms. I can bring them to the guest house this evening. Standard forms. The same phrase she had used regarding the Heritage Committee application that would have formalized the erasure of my contributions. My architectural training had taught me to read the fine print, especially when presented as standard. We need to act decisively before these restructuring documents appear, I told Caroline, showing her the message. They clearly intend to further consolidate control while I'm positioned as confused or declining. Caroline nodded. I recommend we take 2 immediate actions. First, formally document your intellectual property rights to prevent any attempted transfer. Second, secure your financial resources against potential manipulation. And I would suggest a third, Dr. Chen added. Begin establishing independent evidence of your cognitive capacity to counter any suggestions of confusion or memory issues. We considered their recommendations with the same thorough analysis I had once applied to complex structural problems. This wasn't confrontation for its own sake. It was necessary stabilization of a situation being systematically undermined. I'm not interested in public embarrassment or family destruction, I said finally. But I won't allow my life's work to be erased from architectural history or my financial independence to be compromised through manipulation. Caroline began preparing the necessary documentation to protect my intellectual property rights, while Dr. Chen continued cataloging evidence for her academic publication. As they worked, I found myself experiencing something I hadn't felt since Richard's death, the return of my full professional confidence, the architect's mind that sees both problems and solutions with perfect clarity. My phone lit up with another text from James. Mom, Heritage Committee feedback was excellent. They specifically praised the sustainability innovations. Major Architecture Journal wants to interview me about carrying forward Dad's sustainable vision. Great for the firm's positioning. The message crystallized everything. The systematic erasure wasn't malicious in the conventional sense. James genuinely believed the narrative he was constructing. Having grown up watching Richard receive public recognition while my contributions remained behind the scenes, He had internalized a distorted understanding of our respective roles. His current actions stemmed from that internalized misconception, reinforced by gender assumptions and convenient simplification. Understanding this didn't excuse the erasure, but it clarified what restoration would require. Not just legal action, but fundamental correction of a flawed narrative that had developed over decades. "We begin with documentation," I said with renewed conviction, the phrase echoing how I had started every major architectural project. Just as every building starts with a solid foundation. The International Sustainable Architecture Conference buzzed with energy as architects gathered in the Meridian Hotel's ballroom. I stood in the lobby, documentation portfolio under my arm, watching attendees enter the main session where James would deliver his keynote, The Reynolds Legacy, 3 Generations of Sustainable Innovation. My name appeared nowhere in the program. "Barbara Reynolds," a warm voice called. "I thought you weren't attending this year." I turned to find Elena Diaz, a respected architect who had collaborated with our firm on 3 major projects. "I wasn't originally planning to attend," I replied carefully, "but circumstances changed." Elena's gaze dropped to my portfolio, recognition flickering across her face. "James is presenting on the Reynolds Sustainable Systems today. Systems you design." It wasn't a question, but a statement from someone who had witnessed my work firsthand. Her direct acknowledgement created an unexpected moment of validation, the first public recognition of what had been happening since Richard's death. "The historical record should reflect reality," I said simply. "Buildings outlast their architects. Future generations deserve accuracy about who designed the innovations that made these structures significant." Marcus Weber approached from the registration area, his face lighting with surprise. "Barbara, I've been trying to reach you for weeks. This keynote completely omits your contributions." I told the committee it was a significant oversight. But James assured them, "You were having health issues and preferred to remain uninvolved." The systematic nature of the erasure became clearer, not just passive omission, but active misrepresentation of my wishes and capacity. My vertigo incident had been leveraged, not only within the family, but throughout our professional community. "I'm not having health issues that prevent professional engagement," I stated clearly, "and I'm not confused about who designed the sustainable systems being discussed today." Marcus and Elena exchanged glances. "What can we do?" Elena asked directly. "The conference chair should be informed that the keynote contains significant attribution errors," I replied. "The documentation proving authorship is comprehensive and conclusive." Within minutes, Lawrence Sheng, the conference chair, approached our group. His expression shifted from concern to surprise when he saw me. "Barbara Reynolds," he said, "we were told you were unable to participate due to health considerations. As you can see, I am perfectly capable of professional engagement," I replied. "However, I'm concerned about significant attribution errors in today's keynote presentation." Lawrence's brow furrowed. "The session begins in 20 minutes. What specific errors are you referencing?" I opened my portfolio, revealing the meticulously organized evidence. The sustainable systems being presented as Richard Reynolds' innovations were designed by me, as the original documentation conclusively demonstrates. His eyes widened as he scanned the evidence, original sketches bearing my distinctive hand, development notes, technical specifications with my professional stamp, and Richard's explicit acknowledgments of my authorship. "This is substantial," he said finally. "The program materials position these innovations quite differently. The historical record is being actively revised," I explained. "Not through oversight, but deliberate reattribution that contradicts documented reality." Lawrence looked between the evidence and the conference room. "Given the immediate timeline, what outcome are you seeking, Miss Reynolds?" "Accuracy," I replied simply. "I'm not looking to disrupt the conference or create professional embarrassment. I'm requesting that attribution be corrected in alignment with documented evidence." He nodded, professional integrity engaged. "We need to speak with James before the session begins." James looked up from his presentation notes as we entered. his expression shifting from concentration to confusion at seeing me with respected colleagues. "Mom, I didn't know you were coming today." "That seems to be a common misconception," I replied evenly, along with confusion about who designed the sustainable systems you're presenting today. Lawrence stepped forward. "James, your mother has raised significant concerns about attribution in your keynote. The documentation she's provided suggests substantial authorship issues that need addressing before the presentation proceeds." James's face flushed slightly. "We're presenting the Reynolds legacy of sustainable innovation. Dad was the founding visionary of these approaches." "That contradicts the documented evidence," Lawrence said, gesturing to my portfolio. "These original sketches, specifications, and development notes clearly demonstrate Barbara Reynolds' authorship of the systems central to your presentation. Mom assisted with technical implementation," James countered. "Dad's vision guided the overall approach. They worked as a team, with Dad as the principal designer." "That doesn't align with Richard's own acknowledgments," Marcus interjected, pointing to handwritten notes where Richard had explicitly credited me. "Richard consistently recognized these as your mother's innovations, not his own." James stared at the evidence, his confidence visibly wavering. "These are just informal notes. The official firm attribution, the official architectural stamps bear my name," I said quietly. "The patent applications list me as primary inventor. The development documentation shows my design process from concept through implementation." For perhaps the first time, James was seeing the comprehensive evidence contradicting the narrative he had constructed. Not selective memories or disputed recollections, but meticulously preserved documentation of architectural reality. "We have a room full of international colleagues waiting for a keynote presentation," Lawrence said pragmatically. "The evidence suggests significant attribution corrections are necessary. We have two options: modify the presentation to reflect accurate authorship, or postpone until attribution can be properly verified." James looked momentarily lost, the carefully constructed narrative he'd been building since Richard's death confronted with irrefutable evidence. "Mom, why didn't you say something earlier?" "When the Heritage Committee was reviewing the building." "I did," I replied simply. "When Melissa brought the application forms, I explicitly told her the attribution wasn't accurate. When you began describing me as confused about project authorship after my Vertigo incident, I attempted to correct the record." Elena and Marcus exchanged glances, professional understanding of the situation deepening. This wasn't casual oversight but systematic erasure being confronted with evidence. "The conference begins in 12 minutes, Lawrence reminded us. "We need a practical solution." In that moment, watching my son struggle between professional reputation and documented truth, I recognized that this wasn't about victory or vindication. It was about restoration, not just of my contributions, but of James's understanding of our firm's actual legacy. "I propose a modification," I said carefully. "Rather than postponing, we transform this into a presentation on collaborative innovation within architectural partnerships. James and I present together, demonstrating how Richard's spatial vision complemented my sustainable systems design to create buildings now recognized as historically significant." Lawrence looked thoughtful. "That actually aligns better with our conference theme of collaborative approaches to sustainability." "A joint presentation," Marcus nodded appreciatively. "Authentic partnership rather than simplified attribution." James hesitated, professional calculation visible in his expression. "The slides are already prepared with Dad's approach centered, and they can be contextualized through accurate narration," I finished. "Architecture is adaptive, James. Good designers adjust when structural realities require it." The architectural metaphor reached him in ways direct confrontation might not have. A slight nod indicated reluctant recognition of the necessary adjustment. For the next 10 minutes, we worked with the efficiency of an architectural charrette, rapidly modifying presentation materials to reflect documented reality, while maintaining professional value for the audience. James's resistance gradually transformed into grudging collaboration as the evidence of my authorship proved impossible to dismiss. Minutes later, we stood together at the podium. The projected title slide had been modified to include my name alongside James and Richard's, a visual correction that immediately generated murmurs of recognition from those familiar with our firm's work. "Good morning," James began. "We've made a modification to today's session to more accurately reflect the collaborative nature of the Reynolds architectural legacy." He paused briefly. "I'm joined by Barbara Reynolds, co-founder of Reynolds Architecture and the principal designer of the sustainable systems we'll be discussing today." The audience's applause held notes of correction and recognition, many clearly aware of my contributions despite recent attempts to minimize them. As I stepped forward to address the gathering, I felt a complex mixture of emotions: the satisfaction of accuracy restored, grief for the partnership with Richard now properly acknowledged, and hope that architectural truth might provide new foundation for relationship with my son. "Architecture is both personal and precise," I began, finding my public voice after months of systematic silencing. "The buildings we create outlast us, which makes accurate attribution not just professional courtesy but historical responsibility." 6 months later, I stood on the balcony of my new home, morning light illuminating the river below. Unlike the guest house where I'd been relegated after Richard's death, this space had been designed by me, for me. Large windows capturing optimal natural light, ventilation systems incorporating my latest innovations, spatial flow reflecting how I actually lived and worked. Through my studio windows, I could see the Women in Architecture Foundation headquarters taking shape on its riverside site. The construction cranes moved with purposeful precision, gradually manifesting the design I had developed following the Ataguja correction. The building would house Dr. Elgin's research on uncredited women in architecture while demonstrating my latest sustainable innovation. My drafting table now held preliminary designs for 3 new commissions, projects that had come directly to me, following the professional recognition restored through documented evidence. After years of working primarily through our family firm, I had established Barbara Reynolds Architecture at 64, focusing on sustainable innovation in public buildings. Dr. Chen arrived for our weekly documentation session, research materials in hand. "The Library of Congress has expressed interest in housing the complete archive," she announced. "They recognize its significance in correcting architectural history." We settled in my studio, where screens displayed examples of attribution correction from across architectural history. My case had become one module within a larger pattern. Dr. Chen had documented women whose innovations had been systematically credited to male colleagues, partners, or family members. "Your documentation approach has become the template for our archival standards," Dr. Chen explained. "Most architectural records lack this level of developmental evidence, which makes attribution correction much more difficult." "Documentation isn't defensive," I noted. "It's the cornerstone of truth when memories become selective and narratives become convenient." As we reviewed materials, my phone chimed with an email. The Architectural Heritage Committee had approved landmark designation for the Eastridge Corporate Center, with attribution correctly listing me as the designer of its groundbreaking water conservation system. "Another correction secured through documentation," Dr. Chen observed. "The historical record gradually aligning with architectural reality." The attribution restoration process hadn't been simple or without conflict. James had initially resisted comprehensive correction, preferring targeted adjustments that maintained much of the Reynolds legacy narrative, but the documented evidence had proven irrefutable, making partial correction untenable from both professional and historical perspectives. Our relationship had evolved through this necessary disruption, not returning to what it had been before Richard's death, but developing into something new, professional respect that acknowledged architectural truth while navigating complex personal history. My phone chimed again. A text message from James. "Foundation structure, looking good. Innovative approach to load distribution around the atrium space, following the same principles as Riverside, but with significant advancement." The message represented something important: professional acknowledgement of my continuing innovation, not just historical contributions. James had begun visiting the foundation construction site regularly, his architectural training evident in his detailed observations of technical elements. As Dr. Chen departed, Ellen Martinez arrived for our weekly mentoring session. At 32, she represented the generation of female architects who would benefit from the structural corrections we were making to architectural history. Her innovative approaches to community-centered sustainability had immediately captured my attention when reviewing fellowship applications. "My firm just implemented your documentation protocol for our new hospital project," she explained, showing me the comprehensive system she had adapted from my approach. "It creates indisputable evidence of design authorship throughout the development process. Documentation isn't distrust," I told her. "It's respect for the truth that transcends memory and convenience. The concrete reality that stands when revisionist histories begin." After Ellen left, I returned to my drafting table. The rhythm of architectural creation, as familiar as breathing after nearly 4 decades of professional practice. The designs evolved beneath my hands, integrating technical innovation with human experience in ways that had always defined my approach. Later that evening, I moved to my balcony, overlooking the river, and the foundation headquarters gradually taking shape below. The building embodied everything architecture meant to me: innovation serving human needs, technical precision creating practical beauty, documentation preserving authorship for future generations. Looking back over the journey from systematic erasure to professional recognition, I recognized that the restoration hadn't been simple or without pain. Confronting James's deliberate revision of architectural history had been necessary, but difficult, challenging not just professional narrative, but personal understanding of family legacy. What emerged wasn't fairy tale reconciliation, but something more architecturally sound, relationship built on documented truth rather than convenient fiction, professional respect that acknowledged reality while navigating complex personal history, recognition that the Reynolds architectural legacy was indeed collaborative, with distinct contributions requiring accurate attribution. My name is Barbara Reynolds. I'm 64 years old, and this is the story of how documentation preserved architectural truth when systematic erasure threatened to remove me from my professional legacy. If you've ever had your contributions minimized, dismissed, or attributed to others, remember, documentation isn't defensive, it's the cornerstone of truth that stands when revisionist histories begin. I'd love to hear your story in the comments. Have you experienced the erasure of your contributions? How did you reclaim your rightful place?